Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 school shooting database. Unfortunately, while school shootings are rare, there have been enough of them that it brought together a group of school administrators who felt that they wanted to share their experiences with other educators across the country and to help them navigate the really difficult situations in the immediate aftermath and then the long-term recovery from a shooting on campus. So today I'm joined by George Roberts, the former principal of Perry Hall High School in Baltimore County, Maryland, and Andy McGill, the assistant principal of West Liberty Salem High in Ohio. And sadly, they are two principals who have both experienced shootings on campus, but now they are trying to help others through the National Association of Secondary School Principals Principal Recovery Network. George and Andy, thank you so much for joining the show.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having us.
Before we get into the types of resources and education and information that your organization, can offer, where did this idea come from?
David, I do believe that the idea came from the NASSP seeing the work being done already by a few principals, and probably one of the ones that most people are most familiar with would be Frank DeAngelis from Columbine High School. Frank really, post-Columbine, did a lot of work in paying attention to what was happening across the country, especially when it came to school shootings, and he would take it upon himself to reach out to other school leaders just to help, and he would just offer help, offer advice. And whether or not somebody took him up on it, it didn't matter to Frank. He just wanted to make himself available, and he continues to do that. 20-some years later, he still continues that work. And I know that Frank obviously had opportunities to speak at the national level, and I know that's where George and Frank first came across one another, and obviously were able to share their stories with each other and make connections. And I know George had done the work prior to 2019 when the group first got together outside of D.C. at the headquarters there in Reston, Virginia with NASSP. And that's where it started. And there was 19 of us, I think, 20 of us in that room. And we just kind of awkwardly sat and stared at each other for a while. And, it was odd to sit around a room with a bunch of administrators who had experienced the similar things and not really knowing what to do other than we knew we wanted to help one another and help others. And so from that, several years later, it really was a labor to put together a document as a group, the Principal's Guide to Recovery, which is a phenomenal resource that we'd love never to have to give to anybody. But what it does is it helps school leaders, especially principals, walk through the process of recovery after an incident in their building. But that's NSSP saw a need for it, got us together, and they allow us to have the platform to do it, and they give us the resources to do so, and we do that work now. They notify us when there is an incident, and often we do that regionally. We send it out to the group, and somebody regionally will work to make contact, emails, phone calls. We send the guide off, and just an attempt to make an effort to assist.
So both of you experienced shootings on campuses in your career as an administrator, and that happened a number of years before the Principal Recovery Network was formed in 2019. What was it like having that gun violence happen on campus, and what did you feel was missing right then from the types of resources or knowledge or information that you had?
I would say mine occurred on the first day of school in August 2012. And so really right in that area that you're referring to, David, right? 7 years before the formal formation of the Principal Recovery Network. And prior to that, it was just, as Andy's alluding to, kind of a little bit of a connection, reaching out, making, and who can make connections with folks, with really Frank as a hub of that with one or two other principals who have experienced shootings prior to Columbine. So I would say for me in that era, when it happened, it was akin to almost walking in a dark room with your hands out. and you're kind of feeling for the walls, you're trying to feel for the doorknob, the way out, way through. No one had really, and though Columbine had been, 14 years prior, there certainly were protocols in place coming out of Columbine, updated protocols, but I think the leap down protocols occurred, I think really once we got to Sandy Hook and beyond is really where you saw what you're seeing more today in active shooter response. So for me as a principal, what I found is really the biggest area of need, and really looking back and reflecting on it, is the communication within the school, the communication between first responders, understanding that when a situation, when you have an active shooter or a school shooter at the school, you get response from within a 20-mile radius of local, state, and federal law enforcement, regardless of whether there's jurisdiction or not. They just effectively drop what they do and they respond. So because of that, and you couple that with ambulance, fire response, and so forth, there really was, back in 2012, not a really clear communication pathway between, at least what I experienced, between the first responders. It was good, but if I'm looking back 12 years later or 13 years later, it certainly is leaps and bounds better than what it is now in terms of their training for it, their communication protocols for it, how they communicate with school personnel, with superintendents, with school-based leaders. So for me, I would say that would be the biggest area of communication.
And since most of the people in the audience probably aren't familiar with the details of the shooting at your school, just very quickly, kind of what happened, where were you in the school that day, what was the incident?
Yeah, so mine, as I mentioned, was the very first day of school in 2012, so late August 2012. The shooting actually occurred during the first lunch period. So what we would call our A lunch period, we had 4 lunch shifts. So it happened at 10:42. Lunch had started at approximately 10:30. So the shooter, for any number of reasons, left the cafeteria with a knapsack, went into the bathroom that's used during the lunch breaks, went into a stall, assembled a shotgun, loaded it with 2 shotgun shells, stuffed the shotgun under his shirt, and then walked back out across a small lobby into the cafeteria, and then opened fire. The first shell impacting a student probably about 10 feet away from him, about 6 to 10 feet away from him, very close range. Luckily, that student did survive. And then the second shot went up into just above a group of students' heads, into the brick wall and into the ceiling because of the quick action of a staff member who kind of pushed the shotgun up in the air as he was pulling the trigger. So this happened really during the heart of the day, on the very first day of school. Obviously, the protocols put in place. We went through at the time what our protocols. And again, the victim returned back to school. He was in hospital for about 2 to 3 months. Returned to school in December, and actually returned to school about 3 days prior to Sandy Hook, which occurred, I don't want to say December 14th, December 16th of 2012. So we had celebrated his return, and unfortunately, we had the national tragedy at Sandy Hook. So really, in a nutshell, that's what occurred with the shooting. And then our shooter is currently, the shooter at the school is still in prison. He will be there, if I'm not mistaken, he will be there up until about 2035. He received roughly a 25-year sentence. He was a sophomore at the time, so he was 15. So he will be there in prison until about almost 40 years old.
Well, thank you so much for the background on that. And it's interesting how many of these incidents hit lots of the same characteristics. And most of those characteristics are things that are different from kind of the common narrative or the imagination of what a school shooting is. It's rarely a deranged outsider. It's almost always a current student at the school or a recently former student at school who knows the campus very well. It's usually the kids between 14 and 18, but they could be as young as 10 or 12 or into their early 20s. It's almost always a surprise attack that starts in the school. The late morning classes to lunch period are some of the most common time periods. And then it's often in common areas like a hallway or a cafeteria. And almost all shootings begin and end in the same room or the same hallway. And more often than police stopping the shooting, a other student or other staff member is able to tackle or subdue or take away the gun. And I think that just underscores that every single person, regardless of your training, regardless of what you're equipped with, can have agency in stopping these attacks, and just bumping somebody enough that the gun fires into the ceiling can be an act that saves many people's lives. So thank you for all those details there. And then Andy, if you could just kind of briefly do the same with what happened at
Sure.
West Liberty Salem in Ohio and the coach's courage, if I remember.
So we were January of 2017. It was a Friday morning, and our shooting happened right as the first bell rang at the start of the day. We had a young man that had come into school with a shotgun disassembled in a backpack, and then he went into the bathroom stall and he reassembled it and loaded it. He actually had a bag of ammunition with him as well. He was intending to do quite a bit of harm. And as the bell rang, we had a young man walk into the bathroom to check his hair. He was getting ready to leave for a mock trial event, and he surprised the young man with a gun, and then he was shot twice, point blank range with the shotgun. And miraculously, did he survived? His body is still riddled with pellets. He's full of lead, and but he continues to thrive and do well. He's a phenomenal young man. But once that happened, the young man went out into the hallway and shot out the classroom doors across the hall, emptied his gun, went back in the bathroom to reload it. And the young man that was shot was actually able to communicate with him. Just kind of, I think, and that the fact that he was still alive really, I think, caused pause for the shooter. And so the young man started to talk to him a little bit, which allowed opportunity for myself and Greg Johnson to get down to that bathroom. And then once we went in, I recognized immediately who the young man was. It was a young man that I had coached in football. I knew quite well. And once I said his name, he just said, "I'm sorry, coach." And I asked him to put his gun down, and he cooperated, thankfully, because he had reloaded the gun. And he put everything down, and then at that point in time, we were able to end the issue there. But in the meantime, we had a mass evacuation of students from the hallways, out the windows. I'd say there's some very odd similarities between George's and mine situation there. I would say the largest difference is we were very, very rural. And so we're a campus K-12 building. From kindergarten to seniors, we even have a preschool room is here in one big building on our grounds. And so it impacted, I would say, obviously our whole community because we are, our school is the hub of our community. So it is very much one school per district, and that's the way it is. But we had several hundred kids that evacuated and ran that morning. Thinking that there was a whole lot of destruction going on and their friends were dying in the building and things like that. So, that's our event. And I agree with George. The communication piece, probably for us post event in that morning, is just the communication to our staff in the days and the weeks to come because you don't know what to say. You really don't know what to say. Everybody did what they're supposed to do. And nobody died. So you can look at that event and say, what a successful day. I always tell people it's my worst case in education and my best day in education. But the trauma post event, we had no idea how to lead through that. We really, truly had no clue. And that's the difficulty. That was a great difficulty, was leading that through that. Not just for our kids, but especially for our staff and for our community as well. So that I would say that was the biggest challenge for us, is just how to communicate the process of recovery.
Knowing what you know now and what you've developed for the Principal Recovery Network, what would you have done differently in the immediate aftermath in terms of communication? So right there, you made the point that a lot of students had panicked. They thought the incident was far worse than it is. I think that's something that the most common situation for a shooting on campus is a fight between students in the hallway. Somebody pulls a gun. As both of you noted, the guns came in backpacks. And from a study I've done of 1,000 weapons found on campus, almost always in backpacks, almost always concealed. people are rarely walking around with guns until they start using them. But whether it's a lockdown for a hoax or a swatting, or whether it's an isolated shooting during a fight in the hallway, and then the shooter, drops the gun and flees immediately, everybody else in the school thinks that it's the worst case scenario. Every other kid is terrified. How can you communicate to the students in those moments and in the hours after that everything is actually okay now?
Well, I think recognizing that trauma is scar. It scars the brain. Like we know that now. So like I know that now, just in just going through this process and learning more about student trauma, staff trauma. I think for me personally, knowing that everyone experiences trauma differently, therefore the rate at which they are ready to recover fully is vastly different from one another. And so I think educating our staff, we had staff that were certainly they were traumatized, but they were ready to go a couple days later, 3 days later. Let's get back with these kids. Let's get, that's how they experienced it. And that's 100% okay. And then we had several staff that were not okay for a long time. And that is okay too. So I think recognizing and understanding that it looks different between person to person, that would have been helpful for me, especially in the manner in which I communicated to people, because you can't treat everyone you can't talk to everybody the same. You can't encourage everybody the same. They need encouragement differently. They need counsel differently. I think that for me, that's probably the area that I wish I had known more about post event. But I'm honestly, David, I don't know that you can. I kind of liken it to your student teaching experience. You really don't know what it's going to be like to be a teacher till you're actually a teacher. I don't know how I could learn how to communicate in a situation like that until I experienced that situation, and then fully understand the ramifications of how to communicate differently to other people.
And Andy, you mentioned that, some teachers were ready to come back immediately, others weren't. The same goes for students, where some students want to be, right back at the school. I did a recent interview with a parent in Madison, Wisconsin, talking about the shooting that they had on campus. And he has 3 different kids at various levels in the combined middle and high school, and how each one of the kids, one of them wanted to be back with their friends in school the next day. Another one didn't want to go back to the campus for weeks. George, from your experiences, how do you message and start preparing somebody for what they need to think about in terms of reopening and stages of grief and stages of trauma? How do you guide a principal through, say, a question you get about, we just had a shooting on campus, when is it right to reopen? How do we reopen? Who needs to be there and be involved?
Yeah, no, I think, well, first, when coaching principals or supporting principals do something like this, right? Most principals, and this is certainly a bit of a generalization, don't have that authority to make that decision, right? That authority rests with the superintendent of the school system and or the Board of Education. Now, what I have coached and supported is, well, do you have a seat at the table? And can you offer input? And if you do, if someone is asking you the question you just asked, David, as a principal, then then kind of walk through, obviously, what was the evidence? Was there a death? Was there not a death? And you go through these questions because, Andy brought up the 2 sides of the coin. You have those who want to come back and those who don't want to come back. So I think my advice is always to try to accommodate as many of the children as possible, and to really keep the children at the center of your decision. If there are staff who are willing and able to come back, let's say the next day, or 2 days, or 3 days, or a week later, or whatever the case may be, well, then certainly you want to welcome them back with students who are ready or feel they're ready to come back with the appropriate supports inside the building to help the adults and the children. But you need to also give accommodations and plan for the staff who aren't able to return and or the children who aren't able to return. You don't want children sitting at home by themselves, ideally, and you don't want staff really sitting at home by themselves. So you want to provide that opportunity for both of them to maybe they come in gradual entry. Maybe they come in for an hour or two a day and they work their way up. So that's kind of how I coach now, in terms of supporting principals through that. If, again, their opinion is asked for and if they have a say. Because sometimes politics will get into this, unfortunately, and sometimes there's a lot of other factors that will drive district leadership to go one way versus the other.
And I would
And
just
once
piggyback
that
on what
decision is
George
made
said
to,
there. If there's superintendents listening to this right now, your principals need to have a seat at the table. They are vital at that table when it comes to these type of situations. They need to be, they have to be involved. They have a way better finger on the pulse than a district leader does. No offense to district leaders.
so then building on that, Andy, when the decision is made that everybody's going to be back on campus and you're going back into your uh, regular school days, so we're back into full-time instruction again, kind of out of that immediate period of the incidents, what are the things that you need to be thinking about with both students and staff? What kinds of resources are available? And then, in the immediate aftermath, there are a lot of volunteers. There are a lot of, maybe state or school district would be kind of all hands on deck with all the available counselors there in that one school. But that acute period is going to fade pretty quickly, but the trauma is not. So how do you continue to kind of support all the students and staff once you get into, back to life as normal or as normal as it can be?
Right. And we would refer to it as a new normal, because it truly is. You're starting something that is entirely different from that day forward and will be forever in that school, of what that normal looks like. And you're right. You are covered quite well with counselors coming in from outside agencies that are the local outside agencies. Extremely helpful. You keep them there as long as you possibly can, as resources for staff and students. We reopened on the Tuesday after, but for that entire week we were on a delay schedule. We had no more bells in the high school. We did not have bells in the high school for, even though we continued on to what would be a quote unquote normal schedule in the following week. We did not have bells that separated out the classes, because when the bell rang that morning, that's when the gunshots started. And those, there was so many students in the high school that were, when the bell rang, it sent shivers. And so, we shut them off, and we kind of had a town crier at the end of the hallway that would say, "Time to change," and so that became the new normal for the remainder of that year. We continued to have, for us, we relied on Serve Grant money to bring an outside counselor in, because at the time for our middle school and high school, we only had one counselor. Now, we were very fortunate that both of our current school counselors came from the private sector, and so they are actually clinical counselors. And so that's a rarity, I think, in schools. We're fortunate that we have two. Both our middle school and high school counselors are clinical counselors, and they came in and became school counselors. So she was getting crushed, and that's just way too, not only with students but with staff. And so we recognized that in immediacy, and we brought one in part-time, using the Serve Grant dollars to help cover that cost. And then she's now full-time with us, and we've absorbed the cost and understand how to fund that cost. So it's important that you have additional support counseling that lasts as long as it needs to. There is no timeline for that. You use it as long as you possibly can, and as long as it is needed for your staff and your students. And therapy dogs, they love them. Therapy dogs, I don't know what it is about them, but the kids love them and the staff love them. And that was a game changer for our kids, that for sure. Those things they're a godsend.
And is there a formula based on the size of the school for how many counselors you want to target, how many hours you want available per student, how many times you want each student to potentially be talking to somebody?
I think George would probably agree. There's a shortage of counselors for schools. So I think there's always a need for more. At that time we were looking at for the middle school, high school, approximately 500 to 600 total kids for one counselor. And plus you're servicing the staff as well who might need it. That's an impossibility. And so, bringing in the additional one allowed for that load to be lifted from her, because the academic side of things were still going on, and so that's also a huge portion of their job. So I don't necessarily know that there's a formula or a set number that's needed. I just know that you need to have it as long as it is needed.
And then, both of your stories or both of your experiences are about a shooting that's committed by a current student who's there at the school. And I think in a lot of ways that can be one of the hardest situations for students, because if it's an unknown outsider, that's an other, that's somebody that was this, evil person who came in and harmed you. But when it's somebody who's in your community, how do you talk about that person and that student with other students? Is it something where, you never bring up that student again? You give a space for people to talk about both the victims and their classmate who was the perpetrator? Are there any best practices in how you deal with the assailant also being a member of the school community?
Yeah, I think in our instance, it was exactly right. This was a student who, and I suspect Andy as well, played the rural area of the country, but certainly in the larger metropolitan area where I live, this was a student who still was with a lot of these students from kindergarten, went through elementary, middle, and ultimately to high school. Well known to the point where once everyone knew who it was, all the history comes pouring out, right? Because just though it's a big town, it's a small town. So that information, it wasn't something I planned for. It wasn't something that I structured. If children talked about it, then they talked about it. If adults talked about it, then they did. If it was part of their healing process, it was part of their healing process. There was never any marker in terms of through the healing process. If you're going to engage in a community circle or a restorative circle or therapeutic circle, multiple people, multiple kids and or adults talking, or one-on-one counseling and support, you really just follow the lead of the participants in terms of what they need and what they're saying, and you kind of respond and guide the conversation that way. I think certainly if you or your audience were kind of a fly on the wall in our network, right, and how we talk about our occurrences and our shootings at our respective locations, it's always interesting to hear how each of us refer to the actual shooter, right? Even in this conversation, right, I refer to mine as the shooter. Some people will refer my name to the shooter. Some won't even mention it. Will use some other type of pronoun or some other way to address, to kind of identify that person. So that's really and I think that's how the community and how the kids and how the adults process that, right? So even as personally, we carry that, and when we speak or we do things like this, we each refer to the shooter or the aggressor in multiple ways, which I've always found interesting as the group formed over the past 6 or 7 years. As one of the ways I think we process it, we deal.
And I think, we're focused right now on the pre-planned kind of indiscriminate attacks at schools. But suicides on campus are actually far more common than those attacks. And they're almost always a current student at the school. So each year, there are, 5 or 6 shootings that happen. They're often very public at the front of a classroom or in the cafeteria or the front atrium as students are getting there. Some of them are more private in the bathrooms, but people still hear a gunshot and the school goes on lockdown. And then there's a classmate then who's gone. Do you have any guidance for principals, or are you engaged at all in those more isolated instances where really the shooter is the only victim, and that is a student at the schools? I feel like a lot of schools don't have a plan for, that suicide on campus or that isolated domestic violence incident on campus.
Yeah, I would say when I had left my school as a principal and moved to central office, I was supervising a school this is probably not that long ago, certainly within the past 10 years, I was supervising a school where, of all people, and maybe surprising or not surprising, depending on the profession, the school resource officer. So a duly certified police officer for the county was in his office, and just as you described, he was in his office. His door, I don't know if it was closed or cracked, but it was certainly during class time, removed his service weapon out of his holster and shot himself in the head and killed himself in his office. So that's exactly what, so kids heard the shot. And certainly some may have seen what had happened, the aftermath or the after effect of that. So I would say there was the response to it was very similar to what I think Andy and I or any principal or any school leader goes through in an active shooter. The net effect of that suicide, particularly by a school resource officer, but by anyone, the response was the same, right? You get the response from first responders. That really is a full-blown response. You get the lockdown situation. You may get the evacuation, whatever the response was. I think we were in active response in our school system at the time. So whatever the response pattern is, that goes into effect. But then, as Andy mentioned, right, we apply for a Project Serve grant, bringing in extra counselors, bringing in extra support, cording off that section of the building. Really, in this case, kids, I believe, came back the next day, at most 2 days afterwards. So the school wasn't closed really for that long, but we still had to prepare the same way that we prepared in reopening Perry Hall was very similar to the way we reopened that particular high school, because the trauma is still the same, right? The kids associate trauma to various sounds or various smells. And so we really had to prepare as if, no different than that officer maybe walking out in the hallway and opening fire. Though the effect isn't as severe in terms of harming or killing other people, the net effect trauma is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've talked about, the moments right after the shooting, the days after, the weeks once you get back to that new normal. Within your guide, you also have information about the best practices for annual remembrances or other sort of memorials or commemorations. Andy, what kind of guidance can you give to somebody around, what you do, say, a year after the shooting?
Yeah, one of the things that we did, and we came about this, I think, through conversation with some other principals who had experienced similar situations. When it came to and we don't really refer to them as anniversaries. That's one of the things that a lot of people, because anniversaries typically is a happy thing. We don't ever really use that term, and but on the day of remembrance, that when we had ours, we really tried to transform that into a service day. Now I will say the date at which it fell for us, it happened, that day was on a Saturday the next year. So we had that Friday, the actual day before the day of the shooting, that we had a service project. So we realized that how many people really poured into our district. And so we encouraged our kids to pour back out into those various areas. So, the signs, the posters, the cards, the food, the cookies, the just everything that came pouring into our building, our kids kind of turned that around, and it became a day of service. And so, and that it wasn't mandatory. We turned it into an opportunity to give back. And I would say about 90% of the students, especially in the high school, they did stay to do that project. And, we were able to give a lot back to all the first responders and that surround us. A lot of the neighboring districts that really reached out, we were able to turn back and, give back to those school districts as well. Even to the local animal shelters, just because the kids are like, what can we do for the dogs? Well, they turned that into a project for the local shelters, and, either it was either food or treats or different toys and things like that. And for us, it almost became, in a sense, a celebration of truly who we are. And that's what we wanted our kids to really be focused on, is who are we as a district? Who are we as a community? And what truly represents us. And so I think they saw that what really was representative of our community was the outpouring of giving to our school. And so they wanted to reflect that back. So I would look for opportunities to serve. You are going to be crushed with support. I think one of the best ways for your kids to remember that day is to remember and pull the positive things that really did shine, because if not, you're going to dwell on the negative of it, and that's just not healthy. It's not healthy for anybody. So find the positive in it, and then and look how to take that and give it back to everybody else.
I think that is really an important idea to note for the immediate aftermath as well, because if you're in a situation where, say, your school's going to be closed for the rest of the week, but you've got a lot of students, and in some cases, the interviews with students, they talk about how isolating it feels to then, be at home when the school's closed down. If in the back of your mind, when you're thinking about your emergency planning and your recovery planning of what can we engage students in the day after or the week of an incident on campus, that maybe we have a event on campus where we're packing lunches, maybe we're planting trees, maybe we're doing a neighborhood park beautification or something, but a way that the students can be together, be within the structure of some environment, but also having their own time and space to start dealing and processing. I think that is an incredible idea right there, because I think something that does come up is just how isolated kids will feel once they're out of the structure of their day-to-day and their peer networks after they've just had, the worst day of their life as a student. Mm-hmm. So as we wrap up here, I would like to know first, what are your goals for how you want to expand and keep growing your network and keep engaging more principals in not only recovery, but thinking about all of these lessons learned so that they can implement them if the worst does happen on campus? And then how can people engage and get involved with your group?
First, if you want to think about the engagement piece, I think certainly the goal, and Andy mentioned this at the beginning, right? The goal is not to grow. Right? The goal is to keep it the same. Realistically, though, we know that's not feasible. So the way we approach, we've kind of morphed into, and I think even in the creation of the guide, as we were really having large group and small group discussions around the creation of the guide, was it to be as much as a resource post-event, but really also pre-event, right? So if a principal were to read this now without any incident occurring, that it would help them at least be prepared. It kind of goes back to your earlier question, I think, that I addressed, right? So if you give this to a principal who hasn't had it, they can start thinking about it. And not that they would do anything necessarily, but at least that feeling I described in my earlier question, like kind of walking around in the dark. Had I had this guide or someone presented it to me or shared a link to me and I had read it, just even casually read it, it was written in a way that really is only about 15 pages and it's not dense material. The content is heavy, but the actual reading of it is not heavy. So it really can be read in no kidding, 15, 20 minutes, if not in full detail. And that's by design. So I think one of our goals is to really get it out to folks, right? So your opportunity in reaching your listeners and your viewers, getting it out on the mainstream media, whether it's a Newsweek, some type of New York Times that covered the article, but even down to the more local media, whether social media or network media, you know that. So our goal is always to take advantage of these opportunities that yourself and other journalists provide to really spend time in saying, hey, we're here, right? And we're here, and we're willing not only to support, but also maybe help you think about how do you prepare? What is in your emergency plan? How do you write your emergency plan? What are some things you should consider in your emergency plan, worst case scenario? You can build in a lot of these things that where Andy and I and many in our groups kind of just felt our way through. This really does provide a framework. So I would say those are kind of some of our goals. I'll hand Andy in terms of how folks can engage with us or reach out to us.
Yeah, and George is right. One of the things that we when we just had our yearly meeting in June, well, that's one of the areas that we really talked about was the guide's phenomenal, and it's not an end all be all. We definitely tell people that, but it's a phenomenal resource, not only in handling a situation, but in the preparation of potentially handling a situation. But that's one of the things that we kind of talked about is how can we make that guide even, a lot of people say, well, I don't want it to happen at all. So what are some logical things that we could be doing so it doesn't happen? And so I think those are some areas that we want to address uh, when we do some revisions in it, and we will revise it, and it'll take us a little bit of time to do it just because of the nature of the beast. But we want to make it a tool for others so that it's in their hands, and they're only seeing some of the things when it talks about, like, how do you prepare? How do you build relationships with kids? What are some great practices to, improve your culture of your school so that you don't have these things happen? And so that's the goal for us down the road. As far as support, nassp.org/PRN. Go there. You'll be able to see everybody who's a part of the group, but you'll also have an automatic link to download the guide. It's not a financial support; it's a support. It supports our work if you read it, and that would mean a lot to us. I know it would mean a lot to me. I know it would mean a lot to George if you just read the work, so that we knew it was being used and utilized the right way. And so that's a great way to support. Nobody does this for money. I can tell you that much. Nobody does it for money. So we're not looking for that kind of support. We do this because we're passionate about the topic, because we do not want more people in our group. We just do not. And that's not because we're trying to be exclusive, which is, I don't want this to happen to other people. I just don't. It's awful. I just don't want it to happen to other people.
Well, as you mentioned, the guide is available for free. I've got a link to it in the show notes. There's also a link to the Principal Recovery Network website. It's part of the National Association of Secondary School Principals. I want to thank you both for all of your time today. George Roberts is the former principal of Perry Hall High in Baltimore County, Maryland, and Andy McGill is the assistant principal of West Liberty Salem High in Liberty Salem, Ohio. So thank you all so much for your time. I hope that nobody else joins your club this year, but if the worst does happen, they can reach out to you, and hopefully
Absolutely.
Their worst day can be a little bit better than worst days in the past were.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, David.
All right. Take care.
Yeah, no, thank you.